Drum production, in my opinion, is where the vast majority of amateur producers go wrong. The reality is that drum production is possibly half of the entire experience of making a great track. So when I hear music where the drum production is really subpar, it actually hurts the entire production. Whereas if the drums are incredible, it can actually mask other things in the production that may not be the best. So in this video, I'm going to be teaching you a single drum production technique that I was taught many moons ago when I was a lowly intern in a recording studio. And this one thing has forever changed how I go about drum production. So I hope it helps you as well. Now this works in just about any genre. So while the track I'm going to be demonstrating here in this video is with live drums, it's more of an electronic rock track. This works in pop, EDM, rock, or really any other genre where you need to have bigger drums. So I'm going to try to focus on principles here so you can see how you can do this in your own songs. Let's jump into the doc. Okay, so here are the drums that we have recorded. So like I said, these are live drums. Thank you, Matt McLeod, for playing drums on this track. And let me just play a little bit of the verse. I'm just gonna play the entire instrumental here. Drums on their own. All right, cool. So obviously these drums sound pretty darn nice. I mean, just nice and thumpy. And so just so you guys know, we do already have some plugins on the actual drums themselves. You can see some of that here. You can see the kick has a little bit more processing, the snare has a little bit more, but as far as the rest of the kit, there's really not a whole lot of processing happening. Now here's the actual technique. It is that you need to realize that whenever you have live drums, especially with live drums, this is how you get those big sounding live drums, your kit alone is not gonna cut it, okay? So like listening to this, this sounds good. It's not that it sounds bad, okay? This sounds good. But the problem is that that kick, it's really thumpy, but it needs more of that punch. That snare, it's really poppy, but it needs more of that beef on it. And so there's some things that we are missing in terms of the actual tone of the kit. And the reality is that most professional producers are not just relying on these sounds. And so instead what we're gonna do is we're actually going to layer in samples in with these drums. Now there are plugins that you can get where you can actually take the audio and it will basically trigger these samples. And in my case, as you can see here, these are all muted right now. I actually drop the samples directly into the audio, and this is the way I was taught. I don't know, this is just the way I always did it. Again, you can use like a trigger to actually trigger this so it's MIDI, but for me, I actually will go in and I'm gonna line up the samples directly with whatever it is supposed to go with, so that way it is exactly where it needs to be. So for the kick, for example, let's just take a listen to the kick completely isolated here. And so obviously when you solo out the kick, you know, there's a noise gate on there because you're getting all this bleed and all I want is that kick. But in the context, obviously sounds good. So this kick is like really low. It's got a lot of the kind of thump on it, but I really wanted more of that punch. And so what I did is I found a kick sample that accomplished that. You can hear that. This kick right here has a lot more top end. Yes, it has some of the bottom end, but it has a lot of top end that's just like popping out through the rest of this whole thing. So you put these two kicks together, and they essentially round each other out. And then the snare, for example, listening to the snare in isolation, there were some kind of strange frequencies and resonances in the low mids that were really problematic. So this is kind of sounding pretty top heavy because the mids I had to scoop out a little bit more. So in this case, I wanted more thump on this snare. So the snare right now is sounding kind of poppy. It's kind of sounding a little tin. It's not hitting where it needs to hit. So what I did is I found a snare sample that was going to complement that where the other snare is lacking, like this. There you go. And then put these two together. And they are complementing each other. And then the same thing goes on the rack and the floor toms and everything like that as well. So we got the floor tom here, and then add in a sample. And this is the floor tom, and then we have the rack as well. And overall, this is gonna make these drums sound significantly bigger. Now, I think more importantly, you need to hear this in context because obviously it's one thing for me to play these in isolation and hear them. It's another to actually listen in the context of the entirety of the mix. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna go back and forth between playing this without the samples and then adding the samples in. And this is the only thing. Now you can see there are some plugins on these samples, but even without the plugins, these make a huge difference. The plugins are not doing as much as you think they are. So here's without samples. And here's with. Without. And then here we go with. Now let's actually listen in the context of the actual track now with and without the samples. So here's without the samples. With. So as you can tell, this makes a really big difference. So I want to cover just a couple little principles that you need to know when you are actually going about doing this. The very first thing is, and this is the big mistake that people make, is you find samples that sound too much like what you already have. The goal of actually using samples with your kit is not to add more of what you have, it's to add what you don't have. So rather than going into this kick that we're struggling to get that top end and then crank an EQ, which is not actually going to be nearly as effective as just layering in a sample, we're gonna actually find a sample that already has that. So again, if we were to solo out this kick, it's really low, it's got that thump, it's got the pump on it, but we don't have that nice top end happening. So on the kick sample that I put in here, that does. You can tell that actually is gonna cut through the mix a lot better. So again, don't be relying on, cranking your EQs on a kick like what we started with here, hoping that it's gonna get you the same results as actually just layering a kick sample. Layering a kick sample is gonna get you 10 times further than trying to just crank the crap out of the highs on the kick that you already have. So that's the first thing, is that you need to be thinking about this through the lens of you are adding something that you lack. So if you have a kick that sounds more punchy and more poppy, but it doesn't have that low fatness to it, then you want to find a kick sample that's going to have the fatness on it and not the top end on it, so they complement each other. Because the goal here is not to have it sound like two separate kicks. The goal here is to have it sound like one kick. So in this case of the snare here, same exact thing. The snare that we have here, that snare just doesn't have a lot of juice on it. Like it's sounding pretty thin. It's sounding kind of just a little bit like pop, pop. And I want thump, thump. I want like that punch. I want that thump on it. So I'm gonna go find samples that get that done. So when it's all said and done, the biggest thing I want to do as a producer is make as few moves as possible to get the most accomplished as possible. So while many of you might be just reaching for your EQs and trying to crank the living crap out of your highs to get that kick to sound better, why would you do that when you could just drop a sample in there, layer them together, and all of a sudden that one move, done. Now, if you want to see how I actually structure producing a song from beginning to end, I have a completely free workshop where I cover the production roadmap. I have a link in the description down below and also in the comments down below where you can sign up for that workshop. It's totally free. We've already had a ton of people go through it who have said that it is absolutely value packed. I hope to see you there. We'll see you in the next video.